Hello WebSec fans, and welcome to another exciting INFA729 video on the Tangled web. My name is Brad Beltman, and I'm a distance learning student out of Des Moines, Iowa. And for those of you keeping score at home, we're on Chapter 11, which is Life Outside Same Origin Rules. Now, just as an aside, and just for the fun of it, I decided it'd be fun to try to use images throughout the presentation that I could find in a Google image search on Life Outside Same Origin Rules. And there's not a lot of web security relevant stuff that came up. There were a couple things, but just for the fun of it, I thought I'd stick with those. First example being Love Hate Baby. So the same origin policy is all about keeping distinctly different domains separate, and so that's why I put Love Hate Baby up there. It's because there's very few as distinctly separate things as love and hate, so I think he exemplifies it pretty well. Now, according to the book, the same origin policy, or SOP, and I'm going to try not to say standard operating procedure throughout this, but that's exactly what my mind thinks of every time I read that in the book. But according to the author, his quote there, the same origin policy is the most important mechanism that we have to keep hostile web applications at bay, but of course it is imperfect. It often fails at its primary task, which is to keep different content sources separate. And one of the reasons is because it was never meant to be an all-inclusive thing when it was developed. Initially, the focus was on the DOM, or the document object model, which is the document that's exposed to JavaScript. But even then, it left a lot of the peripheral features of JavaScript out. And I'm sure there were probably a lot of new JavaScript features that came in after the policy was implemented that it did not cover. And so that led to, like most things on the web, it led to a lot of ad hoc fixes. So basically, all the different vendors do things differently in their handling of different issues and things that we're going to talk about. But besides JavaScript, there's a lot of examples of cross-domain interactions that happen all the time that are completely outside of JavaScript that the standard the same origin policy doesn't cover at all. One of the examples, one of the very common ones, is navigation, and especially frames, hidden frames, that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But there's lots of other things like linking, which can be sources, style sheets, images, even remote fonts is mentioned in the book as a potential source of issues. And I liked the quote there, developers acted with conflicting assumptions or perhaps had not given them any thought at all. I don't really read that as the author critiquing the developers who implemented the strategy. You got to remember that this was the same origin policy was invented long before the web is what it is today, and so back then, you got static documents that just kind of link back and forth between each other, but there's no dynamic content, there's no frames, there's no complex applications, any of that. So you gotta think of trying to come up with a policy that's going to cover different technologies that hadn't been implemented or even invented yet, and that wasn't even their intent to begin with. But trying to do something like that, it's just impossible. And so, as we're going to see, I mean, that's a lot of the issues that are brought up in this chapter is because that's the policy that's been put in place, and that's what we're using, but it's not what it was intended for. There's lots of things that came along afterward. And it really needs to be updated. It needs to be done from the ground up, and I think that's more the point the author was trying to make. I don't think it was a slight towards the developers that initially came up with the same origin policy. And by the way, that image there was one of the very few that came up from my image search that had anything even remotely to do with web security. So I threw that one out there, but that is a real Internet Explorer error. And I wanted to include that because it actually had something to do with web security. Amazing. And like I said, just to make things interesting, each browser does things completely differently. All the vendors do things completely their own way. There's little, if any, consistency, no standardization in the way some of these things are handled. The book mentions mixed content, the detection of mixed content as an example. And basically it says that none of the browsers do this particularly well in certain situations. IE is good because it just bans it by default, but it doesn't do well in situations like the use of the embed tag or applet. It doesn't pick up on mixed content well, and actually none of the browsers really do. And like I've kind of hinted there, not that I have to tell you because I'm sure all of you know by now, IE is different. Microsoft just likes to do things their own way. Sometimes it's not just web stuff with Internet Explorer, but Microsoft with SMB, they developed their own protocols, NetBoot, there's all sorts of stuff where they did their own thing. And this is certainly not any different with IE. So some of the attack examples brought up in the book are invisible frames, where you can overlay a completely invisible frame over what the victim actually sees, trying to get them to click on say a button that they don't see. They think they're clicking something else. So obviously it's going to do something completely different in the background. Shifting focus, so they think they're typing into one text box but it could be another. Cross-domain drag and drop. An interesting scenario in that one that the book brings up is tricking a victim into doing something as mundane as just grabbing the scroll bar and moving it, but it's actually pulling content off of one domain into like an embedded frame that's then readable by another domain. Keystroke redirection, that's another interesting one. The author makes the point that you can set this up pretty easily based on context and certain characters out of language. So you can use JavaScript. So you can say on key down, do whatever, whatever the attacker is going to do. But you can predict that pretty easily just based on characters that are typed. On the context. You can predict this pretty easily. One of the larger examples from the book is something that Chris Evans developed, basically taking advantage of fault tolerance in CSS parsers. So basically CSS parsers will attempt to recover from any errors by just starting from the nearest curly bracket and just ignoring the stuff that it doesn't understand. And so the way he took advantage of this is an attacker can create an actual HTML document that has CSS rules embedded in it. Now between these rules, it'll call sensitive data. So one of the CSS rules could be something like, it's going to call it to URL. So if the attacker wants to get some information from the victim on this particular URL, the rule is going to reference that URL. Then it's going to, try to just pull, call some sort of sensitive information, whatever the user wants. In the book, it was the username, and then it'll be. And then the other rule, the CSS rule, then after that is something building like like a class basically. So then the attacker can create a malicious web page then that he tries to trick the victim into visiting, which will then call that HTML document as basically as a style sheet. The browser will go out there and grab it and pass it right over to the CSS parser, and it will just ignore all the HTML stuff that it doesn't understand, find that valid CSS rule, and basically process it. So now, when applied to a class that was specified in the style sheet, the malicious site will, the class is specified in the malicious site. The browser will attempt to load the URL and will leak the sensitive information. Oops, I got a typo there. It's leak, not lead, the sensitive information. It will leak that sensitive information to the attacker. There's also some other pretty large privacy concerns that the book brings up. And this is basically where attackers can collect data about a person's interaction with unrelated sites. And according to the author, a lot of these are things that have been known for quite some time, a decade or more. Simple things like measuring the time it takes to load a page. The idea being if the page loads fairly quickly, it's probably been cached by the browser, meaning it had already been visited. So if an attacker can go through a list of sites in that way and measure the time, which is fairly simple to do with JavaScript, they can figure out what sites the user had already been to. Grabbing images that require authentication, the thought being if the image comes back, then that person is authenticated to the site. Loading unrelated invisible frames is a little bit what we talked about. Profiling visited links, which another example on that is this one. I included this one because I just really like the creativity behind it. And by the way, this image is the only one I didn't use out of the Google image search because I found that trying to describe it without the visual is just extremely hard to do, and I just didn't think it would be very good. So I did pull this one out of the book and include it. But the idea is the user is presented with a fake CAPTCHA consisting of LCD-like digits like you see down there. It's not a real challenge. It's just reading the visited styling applied to some superimposed links. So these can be any links that the attacker wants to know about, basically. So the attacker can't see this directly, what's being presented to the user, but by typing the number back, the victim is basically just unknowingly telling the attacker exactly what style is applied. So knowing that, the attacker can now just look at that and see which sites have been visited, and it's been proven that this can pretty reliably create a browsing history. So for example, all of these sections here would represent different sites, and this site, like it shows, is bunnyoutlet.com. If it had been visited, it'd be white. This one's fuzzy bunnies. If it had been visited, it'd be lit up, and so on. So in conclusion, I like the author's quote here. One of the big things to take away from this chapter: when we need to fix each case individually, something is very wrong. And there are a lot of things presented in this chapter, and I didn't go into depth in all of them, but I mean, there's a lot of privacy issues, some decent attacks that can go on, just taking advantage of the limitations of the same origin policy. And he's right. I mean, there's got to be a more concentrated effort. It shouldn't just be left up to researchers to bring this to the vendors' attention, and the vendors implement fixes however they see fit, or don't even do anything, and sometimes these things go on for years. I mean, that's happened in the past too. So he brings up a good point that there should be, I think he's saying basically, I think there just needs to be more unity, and we shouldn't be fixing this just on a case-by-case basis. And maybe he's even suggesting that a lot of these things need to be revamped or remodeled from the ground up, because a lot of them, like we said, are very old, ancient things, old protocols, old policies, things like that. But it's worth noting that not all of them, all the issues come from old, outdated things. The book uses Canvas as an example. Canvas is a tag in HTML5, which basically allowed the creation of vector graphics, and there was a way to use that across domains to read pixels, which you might say, pictures big deal, but pictures can contain sensitive information as well. And I mean, when you can hide full documents in a JPEG using steganography, I could see there being different ways to hide cryptic messages and that, and being able to read them back and things like that. And there's all sorts of possibilities there. Luckily, that is one of the things that has been fixed, which is nice. I mean, that doesn't always happen where things are exposed and fixed quickly, but that is one of the instances where they were, so props to that. And by the way, I made it all the way to page 29 of the Google Images, which was the last page, before I found any images of the book itself. And like I said, there was very little to do with web security. This one I had to include though, because it just made me laugh, the 404 fire truck. So I threw it in there just for your entertainment. But that's all I got. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.